Quiet thoughts on declining savings. Tonight, we drift gently into a story about the slow, subtle shifts in our financial lives. The ones that don't arrive with noise or urgency, but with a quiet softness, almost like the dimming of a light at the end of a long day. Welcome to Bedtime Finance Stories, where we explore the calm side of money, the side that whispers rather than demands. In this episode, we settle into the simple truth that savings don't decline overnight. They drift, they respond to life, they shift with rising costs, unexpected moments, small comforts, and the quiet realities of being human. As you rest, I invite you to feel the rhythm of this story, the way you might listen to a slow bedtime tale. Steady, gentle, without pressure. Here, declining numbers are not warnings, just signals. Soft indicators that life is moving, that needs have changed, and that awareness can be the first calm step back toward balance. So take a slow breath. Allow the weight of the day to loosen, and let this quiet reflection keep you company in the stillness of night. Now, let us begin. Quiet thoughts on declining savings. The night was still, and the apartment was filled with the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of traffic far below the window. Daniel sat at his small kitchen table with the lights dimmed, his laptop open in front of him, the banking app glowing quietly on the screen. He wasn't in a crisis. There were no collectors calling, and the rent was still paid on time. But his eyes kept returning to a single line of numbers that seemed smaller than it should have been. His savings balance. It wasn't that long ago, he thought, that this number felt heavy and solid. It had been like a quiet anchor in the background of his life, something he rarely checked but always trusted was there. Each month, a little more. Each year, a feeling of subtle progress. He remembered the simple satisfaction of watching the bar grow higher on his savings chart, like a slow sunrise. There had been comfort in that rhythm. Now, the rhythm had changed. The line still existed, but it sloped gently downward instead of climbing up. A few months of higher grocery bills, some unexpected medical costs, a sudden rent increase, and a stretch of weeks where he felt too tired to cook and ordered delivery more than usual. None of it felt dramatic at the time. It was all just life, one small choice after another, each one justified, each one understandable. He scrolled through the transaction list. The entries blurred together in a soft cascade of dates and amounts. There were familiar names for streaming services, food delivery, transport apps, subscriptions he barely used but hadn't canceled yet. A subscription for an online course he'd meant to finish. An app he downloaded once and never opened again. The numbers themselves were not large, but they repeated with a steady persistence. $5 here, $10 there. A small monthly fee that he hardly noticed, except now, under the cool glow of the screen, they formed a quiet pattern. Not a catastrophe, but a slow drift, like sand slipping away from the base of a structure. He leaned back in his chair and let out a slow, measured breath. The room felt safe. The ceiling, the walls, the familiar objects around him, all of it remained unchanged. Yet something in his financial landscape had shifted. His savings were no longer gently rising. They were, in their own quiet way, declining. He thought about the stories people told about money. Dramatic stories of sudden bankruptcy, huge debt, market crashes, or overnight success in the stock market. Those stories always came with sharp turning points, a moment when everything changed at once. His story didn't feel like that. It felt soft and slow, like a tide gently receding, almost unnoticeable until one day he realized the shoreline had moved. He clicked over to the chart view. A gentle slope downward over the last 12 months. The line wasn't steep. It looked almost harmless. But what unsettled him wasn't the severity. It was the direction. At some point, Without him noticing or deciding, the flow had reversed. Instead of building up a reserve, he had started quietly dipping into it. He let his hands rest on the table and listened to the silence of the room. There was no one else here to blame or reassure him. This was just a moment of noticing. A still, calm awareness that his savings were no longer what they used to be. He thought back to the first time he opened that savings account years ago. He remembered the small sense of pride he felt with his first deposit, the promise he silently made to himself that he would build something stable, something protective. Life had not been unkind to him, but it had been persistent in its demands. And somewhere along the way, those demands had grown just a little faster than his income. Daniel glanced once more at the balance, then closed the laptop gently. There was a kind of relief in not staring at the numbers anymore, in letting the room return to quiet shadows and familiar shapes. The problem had not been solved, but naming it, seeing it clearly, had made it less vague, less mysterious. He got up, poured himself a glass of water, and stood by the window. The city lights glowed softly, steady and indifferent. Other people in other apartments were thinking their own quiet thoughts about money, about bills, about savings accounts that went up and then up again. His situation was not unique, and somehow that made it feel less heavy. Perhaps, he thought, this was not a personal failure, but a signal. A gentle bell ringing in the background, calling his attention not to panic, but to awareness. He let that thought settle as he finished his water and turned away from the window, ready to sleep with the awareness that something needed to change. Eventually, slowly and calmly. In the soft quiet of the night, he allowed himself a simple truth. Declining savings did not mean he was broken. It simply meant the story was still being written. And noticing the pattern was the first small, steady step toward turning it. Sometimes, the numbers speak in whispers before they ever shout. And if we listen carefully, the whisper is enough to guide us toward a gentler path. The next evening, Daniel returned to the same spot at the kitchen table. But this time, the moment felt slightly different. The previous night, he had only observed the decline. Tonight, he wanted to understand it. Not with harsh judgment or dramatic plans, but with the same slow, steady energy that had once helped him build those savings in the first place. He opened his laptop again and logged into his bank account. But now he kept a small notebook beside him, its pages blank and quiet, waiting. He decided he would not try to fix everything in one night. Instead, he would simply map out what had happened, like a calm investigator tracing the steps of an event that unfolded gradually over time. He filtered the transactions by category: groceries, dining, subscriptions, transport, healthcare, miscellaneous. Each category formed a small river of money flowing away from his account. The numbers themselves were neutral. They told no story of guilt or virtue. They were just evidence of choices. He started with the biggest changes. Rent had gone up last year. It had been a necessary move. The old building had been sold, the landlord changed, and with the new owners came a new price. He remembered feeling a spike of anxiety when the notice arrived, but he told himself it would be manageable. And it had been, in the sense that he still lived there, still paid on time, still had a roof over his head. The cost, however, had quietly been absorbed by his savings. Next, he looked at groceries. Prices had crept up, and he could see it in the numbers. What used to be a consistent pattern now held slightly larger amounts. He thought about the moments in the supermarket where he hesitated before placing something back on the shelf, but then kept it anyway. Food, after all, was not exactly optional. Then there was dining out, deliveries, small treats for himself on evenings when the day felt heavy, meals with friends where he didn't want to be the one counting every cent. He didn't regret those evenings. They held laughter, conversations, a sense of connection. Still, he could see them here now, another subtle current in the gradual downward slope. The subscriptions were different. Some he barely remembered signing up for. A free trial that became a monthly fee. An app he thought would change his productivity. A premium version of a service he didn't really need. These, he realized, were like leaves caught in the current, small enough to ignore individually, but collectively steady in their pull. He wrote each category in his notebook, along with a few simple notes. No blame, no harsh words. Just acknowledgement. Rent increase. Unavoidable, but not fully adapted to. Groceries. Prices up. No real adjustment made. Dining delivery. Comfort spending on hard days. Subscriptions. Mostly background noise. As he wrote, something softened in him. The decline in his savings was no longer an abstract, frightening force. It was a series of understandable causes, layered over time, economic shifts outside his control, habits within his control, but largely unexamined, emotional moments that led to small comforts. The story, he realized, was not about irresponsibility, but about life drifting forward while his plans stayed in the past. He turned to another page and drew a simple timeline of the last 2 years. On it, he marked the rent change, the month he had that unexpected medical bill, the period when over time hours dropped and his income slightly shrank. He marked the month he joined a friend's streaming party and subscribed to another platform, the time he upgraded his phone and paid in installments, the week he felt burned out and relied heavily on deliveries. When he looked at the timeline, it felt strangely peaceful. It was not chaos. It was a story. It had context, reasons, and quiet turning points. His savings hadn't declined because of one single mistake, but because of many small shifts that had gone largely unnoticed. He closed the notebook and sat back, letting his eyes rest. The numbers on the screen had not changed, but his relationship with them had. Instead of feeling like a victim of something vague and looming, he felt like someone who had finally turned on the light in a dim room. The furniture was the same. He just saw it more clearly now. The drift in his savings, he realized, was not a moral failing. It was a sign that his financial habits and his financial reality had fallen slightly out of sync. And like two lines that had gradually diverged, they could, with time and attention, be gently realigned. He turned off the laptop and let the quiet settle again. Outside, the sky was a deep blue, the last traces of daylight slipping away. Inside, there was a sense of calm understanding. He did not know exactly how he would adjust things yet, but he no longer felt lost. When we map the slow drift instead of fearing it, we often find that the story makes more sense than we expected. And in that understanding, a new kind of quiet control begins to return. The following weekend, Daniel decided not to open his banking app at all, not out of avoidance, but out of intention. He had spent the last 2 evenings observing and mapping his situation. Now, he wanted to simply sit with what he knew, without rushing into solutions that might be fueled by panic rather than clarity. He spent the morning doing simple chores, washing dishes, folding laundry, slowly tidying the corners of his apartment that often went ignored. There was a quiet satisfaction in ordering the physical space around him. As he smoothed the sheets on his bed and aligned the pillows, he noticed how similar this felt to what he had done with his finances, taking something messy and making it visible, manageable, and gently more organized. In the afternoon, he made a cup of tea and sat by the window with his notebook. He did not write numbers this time. Instead, he wrote sentences that began with, "I feel," about money, about savings, about the quiet anxiety that came whenever he thought about the future. "I feel uneasy when I see my savings go down, even if the reasons are understandable. I feel ashamed sometimes, as if I should have known better or done more. I feel tired when I think about constantly needing to adjust, to adapt, to keep up. I feel guilty when I remember the times I chose convenience instead of restraint." He paused after each sentence, letting the words rest on the page. He didn't argue with them. He didn't try to correct them. He simply allowed them to be acknowledged. The discomfort around money was not a problem to be erased. It was a feeling to be understood. He remembered how, in the past, he often responded to financial stress with extremes. Either he ignored the problem entirely, distracting himself with entertainment, or he swung in the opposite direction and tried to design a strict, unsustainable plan that left no room for joy, rest, or error. Both approaches, he now realized, were symptoms of not being able to sit calmly with discomfort. This time, he wanted something different. He wanted to be able to look at his declining savings and feel the discomfort without letting it swallow him whole. To treat it like a piece of weather, real, noticeable, but not permanent. He added more sentences. "I feel a small sense of relief now that I understand why the numbers declined. I feel curious about what small changes might slowly reverse the trend. I feel hopeful that I can adjust without punishing myself." He underlined the word hopeful gently. It was not a loud hope, not the kind that promised instant transformation or radical change. It was a modest, quiet hope, like a candle that doesn't try to fill the whole room, but is determined to keep burning. As the afternoon light shifted, he thought about the concept of financial resilience. Not as an unshakable perfection where savings always rise, debt never appears, and expenses stay predictable, but as the capacity to bend without breaking, to adapt when circumstances change, and to understand that sometimes savings go down for a while, and that does not erase all the years they went up. He realized that part of his discomfort came from the belief that progress always had to be linear, that savings should only move in one direction, higher. Yet life did not move in straight lines. There were seasons of accumulation and seasons of dispersion, times of storing up and times of slowly drawing down. Declining savings in this phase of his life did not necessarily mean failure. It might simply mean he was in a season of higher demands. He closed his notebook and sat quietly, watching people move along the sidewalk below. Each person carried their own private stories about money, about enough and not enough, about rising balances and fading cushions. He wondered how many of them, like him, were quietly wrestling with financial discomfort they felt they should have outgrown by now. There was a gentle solidarity in that thought. Not a comparison, not a competition, just a recognition that money was part of being human, and that feeling uneasy about it was not evidence of personal weakness. It was an invitation to pay attention. As the evening approached, he made a simple dinner, cooked at home with ingredients he already had. Not as a grand act of frugality, but as a quiet, almost meditative choice. To nourish himself, to spend a little less today, and to remember that he could take small actions without needing them to solve everything at once. When he finally lay down to sleep, he did so with a slightly lighter chest. The numbers in his account were the same as they had been the night before, but something in his relationship to them had shifted again. He was learning to sit with financial discomfort, to let it exist without letting it define him. Sometimes the first real change is not in the balance itself, but in our capacity to stay present with what that balance evokes. Quiet acceptance can be the soft ground where wiser choices begin to grow. A few days later, after the initial wave of reflection had settled, Daniel returned to his notebook with a new intention. He did not want to overhaul his entire life. That kind of drastic shift had rarely worked for him in the past. Instead, he wanted to explore what gentle adjustments might look like. Small, sustainable changes that respected both his financial reality and his emotional well-being. He began with the subscriptions. This felt like the least emotionally heavy place to start. He opened each service one by one and asked a simple question: if I had to sign up for this today, knowing my current situation, would I still choose it? For some, the answer was yes. A music service he used daily while working, a cloud storage plan that held important files, a language learning app he genuinely enjoyed. These were tools that added value to his days, that gave more than they took. For others, the answer was a quiet no. A premium version of a streaming platform he barely opened. A trial for a workout app he'd never really started. An online magazine subscription he'd forgotten existed. Canceling them was not thrilling, but it felt like gently closing doors he no longer needed open. Each cancellation was a small nod to his future self, a few dollars less leaking out each month. Next, he turned to food. He knew he couldn't magically lower grocery prices, but he could adjust his habits around convenient spending. He didn't set a strict rule like no more delivery ever. Instead, he made a softer promise to himself. Delivery would become an occasional treat, not an automatic response to feeling tired. He wrote in his notebook, 2 delivery meals per month maximum, and then added, plan one ahead as something to look forward to. By transforming delivery from a reflex into a deliberate choice, he shifted its place in his life. It was no longer a quiet drain, but a small, planned comfort. He also made a simple list of easy meals he could prepare with minimal effort on tired days. Pasta with a basic sauce, soup with frozen vegetables, rice with eggs, and a few seasonings. He wrote them down, not as obligations, but as gentle reminders that he had options before pressing the order button. Then he looked at his social spending. He didn't want to become isolated or turn money into a reason to decline every invitation. Instead, he thought about ways to still say yes, but differently. Meeting a friend for coffee instead of dinner. Hosting a simple night in with homemade snacks instead of going to a pricey bar. Sharing costs more transparently, suggesting affordable options without shame. As he wrote these ideas, he noticed how calm he felt. None of these adjustments demanded that he deny himself joy or connection. They simply asked him to participate in those experiences with more intention. Finally, he looked at income. He knew that cutting costs could only go so far. The real turning point might come from earning a little more, even if just temporarily. He didn't pressure himself to find a new job overnight, but he brainstormed quietly. Occasional freelance work, offering a skill to someone who might need it, asking if extra hours were available at work, or slowly preparing for a higher-paying role in the future. He didn't need all the answers now. What mattered was opening the door in his mind to the idea that income, too, was not fixed forever. When he stepped back and looked at his list of gentle adjustments, it didn't feel like a punishment plan. It felt like care. Not just for his bank account, but for the person living inside the numbers. The version of himself who deserved both protection and ease. He knew that these changes wouldn't dramatically alter his savings in a week. The slope of his chart might not reverse immediately. But he also knew that the same quiet, consistent actions that once built his savings could, over time, protect and restore them again. As evening deepened, he closed his notebook and looked around his apartment. The space was the same, but his sense of agency within it had grown. He was no longer only reacting to what had happened. He was responding gently, thoughtfully, in small steps that he could continue tomorrow and the next day without burning out. Real change often begins with soft shifts, not hard rules. When we adjust gently, we leave room for both discipline and kindness to coexist in the same breath. Weeks passed, and Daniel quietly practiced his new habits. Some days he followed his plans closely. Other days he slipped a little. But instead of seeing those slips as failures that erased all progress, he began to view them as part of a wider pattern, one that still leaned, overall, toward more awareness, more care. One evening, he opened his banking app again and studied his savings balance. The number had not dramatically increased, but the decline had slowed. The slope of the chart had softened. It was no longer a clear downward line. It was beginning to flatten. There was something deeply calming in that visual. The fall had been slowed, and that too was a kind of victory. As he stared at the chart, he found himself asking a deeper question. What did savings actually mean to him? For years, he had regarded it as a score, a measure of how well or poorly he was doing as an adult. When the number went up, he felt competent. When it went down, he felt lacking. The number was not just money. It was judgment. He wondered what might happen if he loosened that association. If savings could simply be what they truly were, a tool, not a verdict, not a moral grade. He turned to his notebook and wrote, "Savings are a buffer, not a personality test." Underneath he added, "They protect me from shocks, but they do not define my worth." This shift, though subtle, felt profound. The decline in his savings no longer had to be a story of "I am failing." It could instead be a story of "My buffer has been used, and now I am learning how to rebuild it." The narrative changed from self-blame to stewardship. He thought about people who had drawn on their savings during job losses, medical emergencies, family crises, or global events that shook entire economies. Their savings had done exactly what they were meant to do. They had cushioned the impact. Yet many of those people, he knew, carried shame about the fact that their balances were no longer as high as before. It occurred to him that expecting savings to only ever rise was like expecting an umbrella to only ever stay dry. The point of the umbrella was to be used in the rain. The point of savings was sometimes to be used in hard times. He let that analogy sink in. His own declining savings, in part, reflected a world that had become more expensive, more demanding. They reflected times when he had needed support, and that support had quietly come from the money he had set aside. In that sense, the decline was not only a sign of drifting habits, it was also a sign that the system had worked. This reframing softened the edges of his anxiety. Instead of grieving the perfect upward trajectory that had been disrupted, he began to appreciate the role his savings had played. They had allowed him to navigate rising rent without immediate panic, to handle medical costs without borrowing at high interest, to maintain some stability through shifting circumstances. He realized that what mattered now was not punishing himself for the decline, but honoring the function that savings had already served in his life, and then gently deciding how to protect and grow them again from here. As he sat with this, he felt a quiet gratitude for his past self, the one who had made all those small deposits, month after month, even when his income was modest. That person had unknowingly provided protection for the present version of him. Perhaps, he thought, he could now do the same for his future self, not with grand gestures, but with steady, compassionate choices. He closed the app and looked around his apartment once more. The lights were low, the air still. The chair beneath him, the cup of tea on the table, the soft fabric of the curtains. All signs of a life that was still intact, still moving, still capable of gradual repair. When we stop treating savings as a verdict on our worth, we create space to use them wisely, rebuild them slowly, and live with more tenderness toward ourselves along the way. As another month turned, Daniel received his usual notification. His paycheck had arrived. This time, when he opened his banking app, he did so with a calm intention, not a fearful reflex. He watched the numbers adjust as income flowed in and various automated payments flowed out. For the first time in a while, he paused before everything settled and made a conscious choice. He transferred a small, deliberate amount into his savings account. It was not the largest deposit he had ever made, not even close, but it felt meaningful. After a period of slow decline, this was a gentle push in the opposite direction. A signal, however modest, that the story was shifting. He knew that one transfer would not transform his financial picture, but he also knew that it symbolized something important, a quiet commitment to the future, made without drama, without the need to erase the past. He returned to his notebook and wrote down what he now understood. My savings went down for understandable reasons. I have mapped where my money goes and adjusted where I can. I will continue to make small, steady choices that support my future self. I do not need perfection to move in a better direction. He underlined the last sentence and smiled faintly. It felt like a kind of permission to keep going, even imperfectly, even slowly. Over the next few weeks, life continued in its ordinary rhythm. Some days he spent less, some days more. An unexpected expense appeared one afternoon, and he felt the familiar tightening in his chest, but it passed more quickly than before. He had a plan, however small. He had awareness, and he had begun to trust that he could respond more wisely now. On a quiet evening, he opened his savings chart again. The line, once a clear downward slope, now showed a subtle flattening and the faint beginning of an upward turn. It was not dramatic, and no one else would have celebrated it, but for him, it was enough. He realized that what had changed most over this period was not the shape of the chart, but the tone of his inner voice. The harsh criticism had softened into gentle observation. The panic had transformed into a calm, ongoing conversation with himself. What is happening? What does this mean? What small thing can I do next? He closed his eyes and let his thoughts drift ahead, imagining the future. Not a future of sudden wealth or flawless financial decisions, but a future where he consistently treated his money and himself with steadiness and respect. A future where savings went through natural cycles, and he met each phase with understanding rather than fear. In that imagined future, his savings were neither idolized nor ignored. They were simply one part of a life lived with intention, a source of support, a quiet background presence, like the hum of the refrigerator in his kitchen or the soft glow of the city lights outside his window. He opened his eyes and looked around the room, feeling something close to peace. The numbers in his account were still modest. His situation was still ordinary. Yet the way he inhabited that situation had changed in a profound, quiet way. He did not know what the next year would bring, whether expenses would rise again, whether income would shift, whether new challenges would appear. But he knew that he would meet those changes differently now, with less denial, less self-blame, and more willingness to observe, adjust, and care for himself through it all. Before going to bed, he wrote one last line in his notebook. I am learning to live with money as a companion, not an enemy. He set the notebook aside, turned off the lights, and lay down, the room dark and still. The worries had not vanished, but they no longer pressed as sharply against his chest. They had become part of a larger, calmer story. A story of someone noticing, understanding, and gently choosing again. In the gentle quiet of his life, Daniel came to understand that money was never meant to be a harsh judge, but a soft companion, one that drifted, returned, and shifted with the seasons of living. His declining savings had not been a symbol of failure, but an invitation to pause, listen, and adjust with kindness. And as he moved forward, step by calm step, he discovered that even the smallest choices could slowly reshape his path. In the end, it wasn't the numbers that brought him peace, but the quiet trust that he could meet whatever came next with steadiness and care.